specific data set, right? And that somehow is linked to the data that another person may have, and that's another person. So this can go on, and somehow you're able to reach some kind of conclusion depending on what kind of target surveillance you're doing, depending on who you're looking for, I suppose. Clear technologies. This is not from my research. This is actually in the brochures, in the spy files. I just thought this is very interesting. Apparently, clear trail technologies has the ability to deploy spyware into a target's machine, which I think can be very, very concerning, to say the least. Spy impact cells for kiloton cameras. Now, this can be perceived as funny or scary, depends on how you look at it. I just thought it was interesting because it just shows the level of social integration and surveillance in a way. That surveillance is not only like the hardcore technology sold to law enforcement agencies, but can be like, more subtle objects can potentially be surveillance devices, and what does that mean for the future? Other companies like Nice Steel also sell similar technologies, including spy-fin cameras, LiDAR video cameras. So based on that, I don't know, maybe in the future I have to be careful about what kind of LiDAR we're using, I don't know. Rush Technologies is very interesting, especially in light of the UID. It sells RFID biometric technology. What I think is very concerning is that some of the countries that supply these technologies to include Zimbabwe and Saudi Arabia, non-democracies, and Egypt and Tunisia, transitioning democracies. Why is this concerning? Because when you give a terror regime the technology to be able to monitor the population, when you give them the technology, biometric technology to be able to register everyone's data and through that to be able to surveil them, this can potentially have very severe effects on the right of privacy and human rights. The same goes for Egypt and Tunisia, and I think this is very interesting considering the fact that they had elections rather recently. I wonder if Rush Technologies provide the biometric tech for that. Finfisher, very controversial, very scary spyware, sold by Gamma Group, primarily a UK-based company. As you can see in the map, some countries are, as you can see in the map, India is currently using Finfisher. What is Finfisher? It's spyware which has the ability to take control over a target's computer and capture even encrypted data and communications, which is scary to say the least. Apart from that, it can also evade detection by antivirus software. So if you have some kind of antivirus software and you're using Windows, for example, as am I, well, probably not the wisest choice. But if you're using Windows, for example, and you have antivirus software installed on your computer, don't think that will necessarily protect you from Finfisher. It's able to capture the entire computer, especially Skype and other communications. And how do you actually get Finfisher on your computer? Well, usually if you accept installation of a fake update to company's software, that's one of the ways that you could potentially have installed on your computer. So there's a lot of people who argue that who classify information as risky and non-risky information. So they say that, oh, I have nothing to hide. I am disclosing non-risky information. There's nothing wrong with it. I completely disagree with this myth. I believe that any information can potentially be risky depending on who is looking at it, why, how, and under what conditions. And having said all of this, there is currently no privacy legislation in India, which means that there are currently no safeguards to protect you from all the abuses that can occur from all the previous technologies and the surveillance schemes. So is surveillance justified for cybersecurity purposes? No, absolutely not, at least not adequately.
Thanks, Maria, for that quite impassioned plea on behalf of privacy. Next, I'll call on Jacob Appelbaum, who's known for his work on the Tor project, on onion routing, and as part of WikiLeaks. And Jake, please.
PowerPoint. I'm very honored to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I thought that maybe I could start by saying that I have a similar experience to some of the people here, at least, and it has caused some problems for myself and other people, let's say. But I myself, I think that the work that WikiLeaks has done is extremely important. And it's really only possible to have this kind of investigative journalism with strong anonymity technologies. And so I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about anonymity, but I also wanted to, address the discussion points first. So for example, this question of surveillance making us more insecure. Tell me if I, rephrased this question incorrectly. But it seems to me that the first point is, it's really a good point that's hard for people to understand, especially if they say that they don't understand technology. Because when Richard Feynman, for example, a famous famous physicist from Caltech, also known as one of the fathers of the atomic bomb, when he talked about trying to explain magnetics to the layman, he says you can always essentially tell people an analogy, but you don't really learn by an analogy. If you don't understand the thing, you just don't understand it, and making an analogy won't help really. And so the thing is that without understanding technology, it becomes very difficult, I think, to actually explain how to build a system in a way that complies with, say, an authoritarian's desires to be your master. In theory, there's this idea that you can build a technical system that allows for so-called lawful interception and to still have it be secure. But for example, with the Tor network, we will never put a backdoor into it, even though that means that some people who in India might be considered criminals, they might use it. The fact of the matter is that criminals always have privacy. What Tor tries to do is give every other person on the planet privacy without making you into a criminal, without having to resort to criminal measures. However, if we were to put a backdoor into this system, which we would never do, no matter what, including jail time or having to leave our own countries, seriously, no question of this. The fact of the matter is, as soon as one backdoor is in for one government, that government will use it to spy on every other government that uses it. So for example, when the Dutch police or the American police use Tor to hunt down child pornographers, that is, they hide where they're coming from so as to find evidence of child abuse on the internet anonymously. Imagine if there was another government, let's say the Russian government, that for one reason or another did not want some human trafficking ring to be broken up. They would of course make this so-called lawful interception request, and they would of course use this backdoor against people that are working on things that are upholding fundamental human rights. Right? So the key here is that we either all have this privacy and anonymity, or none of us do, and that even includes the police. Furthermore, it would actually cause some very serious physical and legal ramifications, probably for myself and other people, which is that the drug cartels in Mexico, if, for example, the FBI were using Tor, and there were a backdoor such that the FBI could ask me to intercept communications in Tor, do you suppose that since I am not in the military, and I'm not in the intelligence service, and I obviously do not get along very well with the American police, and so they probably won't protect me the way that they might protect an FBI agent, if I have the ability to activate such a backdoor, does that not put my life at risk? When the Zeta cartel from Mexico decides they wish to find all the DEA agents using Tor, if they are using Tor. You see, part of the problem here is that we shift the risk from previously military targets to civilian targets that are simply not prepared for it. And while I do everything I can to prepare, there is no preparing for a cartel. So the best way to prepare is to make sure that there's no reason for the cartel to come to me. And so that is why we build a system which is privacy by design, not privacy by policy. Because, as most of you know, people break the law. When we use the laws of nature, no one breaks these laws. That is to say that strong mathematics cannot be coerced through violence. No common criminal can solve hard factoring problems. They cannot, it's just a fact. And even some of the best intelligence agencies in the world, they also can't solve these hard math problems. And so the point is, if we wish to have security, we can have it tomorrow. In fact, when we build telephone interception systems, such as the one that was abused in Greece, well, the United States built this. It's called Kalia, which is basically, supposedly, to assist law enforcement. It has a trickle-down effect. So the trickle-down effect that we see is that the Iranians use Kalia-compliant telephone gear to hunt down protesters and to murder them. And the reason is because a telephone switch does not know what a judge is. It does not know what a lawful intercept order is. It has no concept of this, nor can it. Right? These are human institutions that are not technically defined, and even if they were technically defined, a machine can be tampered with, it can be changed. A judge can also be subverted. So in these cases, what we see is that we push this information out there, and we make trade-offs where we don't discuss them. So if we don't look at civil liberties and we only look at national security, in the case of Greece, what we saw with the Athens affair was that a telephone operator actually was found hanged to death in his apartment. Well, why is that? Because he was a, I assume, telephone operator who had access to this switch. And my understanding of these reports is that he did have access to this. So someone went to him, probably forced him to put in this backdoor to spy on the Prime Minister of Greece, as well as members of parliament, as well as other people. And then, when he was of no use to them anymore, and only served as evidence of the crimes they had committed, he was murdered. Do you suppose your telephone switches are any different? No, of course not, right? This is what people are talking about. When they say lawful interception, what they really mean is spying. And when they say surveilling people, what they really mean is And when they say that they want to do this for national security, what they really mean is control through spying. Right? Because what is surveillance? It is control. That's the purpose of all of this. Here's the irony. You can win if you're the CIA and the NSA, maybe. You cannot win if you are not the CIA and the NSA. Right? These people have the whole planet covered with surveillance equipment. So if you wish to be secure, such that they cannot violate the confidentiality of your messages, they can't change it, that is, it has integrity, right? If you want to know who you're talking to is who you think it is, you need authenticity, you may only get these properties that, in a way which we will describe as secure, through mathematics. And it either is secure or it is not secure, as far as we know. And so when we weaken these things for so-called lawful interception, what we actually do is we weaken it such that I can exploit it as well. And I'm not talking about raw, I'm talking about me. I have a $20 cell phone with me, which I can plug into my computer and I can intercept any of your GSM calls. That is because for the FBI to be able to wiretap me, and for Raw to be able to wiretap, well, me as well, but you too, I get to do it. Here's an interesting question about economics instead of civil liberties, because I think it's important to talk about this. If an Indian business person travels abroad, let's say to the United States, and their phone may be wiretapped, is it not the job of the NSA to spy on this person to make sure that they do not outbid Boeing in a contract? Well, that's exactly what has happened with Airbus and Boeing consistently, and the CEO of Airbus has been quite upset about this. The NSA or some other intelligence agency that has an interest in Boeing, which is a very large airplane company in the state in which I live, in Washington State on the west coast of America, consistently, Boeing is able to outbid Airbus because they know what Airbus will bid. And they know because you can spy on them. And why can you spy on them? Because it is in the national interest. It is in America's national interest to spy on these French and European companies. And so we win. And so it is the case that national security thus promotes economic espionage. And we see this happening all the time. So what we must ask ourselves is wiretapping anyway, because I have ways to get past these things. And so it is only the regular people who will be spied upon, not people of a particular class privilege. And I know that that's a touchy subject in India, so I say class from the American perspective, not class in terms of the Indian perspective. But it seems to me that if only special people have these communications, it actually opens up a very serious avenue for national security, which is if you can survey, you will be able to find out who the special people in the society are, because they're the ones that deserve protection. But that means now you know who to target. Instead of 300 million people in the United States, there's probably just, let's say, 4 or 5 million people that are interesting. That's a much easier set of people to target for espionage, for example. So if we look at this and we look at it as a set of trade-offs, we might change security and the internet. I can't think of the word cyber, having grown up in the 90s, in any serious fashion, but if we say cybersecurity in a serious fashion with certain trade-offs, and that includes actually giving up our wiretapping addiction. And it's hard to do that, and there's a lot of tension there. But the reality is that if we don't do that, we aren't securing it. All we're doing is ensuring that when an attacker takes control of a raw agent, or when an attacker takes control of interception points, that they will be able to use that against you. You see, because other attackers, they do not follow the law, and neither do intelligence agencies generally. Usually, in fact, intelligence agencies are above the law, both in how they're created and how they're run. There's usually no accountability. For example, Mr. Datta, great last name by the way, mentioned my right to access about information. Well, I recently filed a Freedom of Information / Privacy Act request in the United States with the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Agency, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, you name it, a whole bunch of agencies. There's like every letter of the alphabet and every different combination in 3 letters. And all of them have either said that they have no records on me, or under the National Security Act, they can't give them to me, but they're not saying that they have any anyway, not to say that by saying this, that they've said that they have said that they have a thing or don't have a thing. Sounds familiar? So that's the kind of accountability that we could talk about. And I've been targeted for the last 4 years by these guys. So detained at airports, questioned about my politics. My partner has woken up with guys with night vision goggles watching her sleep in her bedroom. No answers, right? Never been arrested. Why? Politics. What kind of politics? The politics of effective investigative journalism exposing the criminality, including war crimes, of these agencies and the governments that they support. Right? So this is effective democratic oversight resulting in hardcore political repression using these methods. Right? So I know the NSA's warrantless wiretapping data has been used against me. but I can't prove it in court because they're not required to actually show it, and actually they don't bring it to court, so I can't challenge it. But there are these files, these dossiers that take 10 minutes for someone to read, and I ask what's in it, and they won't tell me. And then I ask them why it's happening, and they say, well, because what's in this file. Something's wrong with that, right? But if you think that India will be the exception with this, I will tell you, the only exception is that it will be the NSA that has the most access to your database, not you, and not your own intelligence agencies. And if you think otherwise, ask yourself, will every single piece of equipment be built by Indians? Will there be no person in there that will somehow be untrustworthy at all? Probably I'm going to go with that that's not the case. So to give you an example, FinFisher is deployed also by Pakistan, right? So Pakistan and India both use FinFisher. Tell me now, when you fund a German company to do all your spying, and you have both of those governments working on spying, does that not give the German company quite a lot of intelligence information on who you target in India and Pakistan? And isn't it then in your favor, in a sense, to compromise FinFisher to know what the Pakistanis know about your intelligence officers in Pakistan and vice versa? Oh my God, what a disaster. And in fact, just last week I discovered custom-made Indian malware on an Angolan activist computer in Oslo at the Oslo Freedom Forum. And it was signed, I won't name the person, but he's on LinkedIn, which is quite funny. Warfare Offensive Capabilities Group that's doing this kind of work here in India, and they targeted an Angolan activist that's working in Africa as an investigative journalist in order to out his sources and to compromise him. What kind of terrorism is that, right? So I suppose that answers the question of, is surveillance political? Well, sure, if you understand that criminality is political, right? That's, I mean, when homosexuality is only decriminalized 3 years ago, it tells you something about what kind of thing masters over slaves in some cases when they do not have a representational vote. It is the case that some people are a certain way, and when the law criminalizes them merely for existing, this is politics, right? And so, as far as the tech not respecting the law, I think that this should be clear as well. Technology cannot respect the law because the law is a non-technical, abstract set of ideas that is reinterpreted. Is the biggest threat arms trade, digital arms trade? It isn't, actually. It's a huge threat. The biggest threat is the flip of being guilty by default until you prove your innocence. That is the biggest threat. There is no bigger threat than that. Because it is the threat that suggests that we must have a surveillance state in order to be proving our innocence. This is nonsense. We are innocent by default. And in fact, when people commit the crime of spying on us, in order to tell us that we need this so that we may prove our innocence, those people should be kicked out on their ass, because those people are criminals. It is not we that are criminals. They must bring the burden of proof to show criminality. And when they do it through spying, and they say, well, we won't introduce it in a court of law, I would say in the 1800s, there was actually a British philosopher who said the freedom from suspicion is one of the most fundamental freedoms. Because how is it that we can say that a person is free when every footstep is followed, every note is written, every association is documented? How can you say you are free in such a case? Now I'm badly paraphrasing what he has said, but it's important to note that this is true. You cannot feel free in a world where you know everything you do is analyzed, interpreted, and then the data trail you leave behind, it tells a story about you which is made up of facts, maybe, but not always, because these logs are not perfect. In fact, I inject funny data into logs like that all the time just for fun, right? So in Qatar, for example, they have this deep packet inspection system that logs when certain people go to certain sites and whether or not it was blocked. Well, I looked up, hey, who in the Qatari intelligence service has what IP addresses? Okay, well, let's make it look like they were visiting hardcore porn, so they get a visit from the censor, authority, so they can look it up. Just inject that data in there. What have you done? Right? Is there due process to ensure that that kind of thing does not happen? Or when it does happen, that there is not an unjust response? Well, of course they don't exist. People don't understand that machines are imperfect. So they just go with it. Hopefully nothing will come of that, but I think the point is when you build these systems without the concept of human justice, because they're machines, then you end up with machines that know no concept of human justice becoming our masters, ruled by people who are outside of democracy, who are unquestionable. I mean, I think it's a big honor to have gentlemen from Raw here, in that, no gentleman from NSA will ever join me on a panel. And I think that it is really important to say that there are legitimate reasons for intelligence. But when we privatize all of this intelligence and we make it total, we're actually driving towards a collision course, where you will either have to give a choice where we decide we will live in a total surveillance state, or we live in a world where we actually have security, privacy, integrity, authenticity, and liberty. And it really will be an either-or situation, but it may be the case that only some people get to make that choice. So only certain members of certain class privileges, certain economic classes. That doesn't really seem like the world I want to live in, and I know I'm kind of a utopianist, but anyone that isn't a utopianist is kind of a schmuck. So I think it's important to recognize this. And so I did want to say one last thing, which is there's this idea, it's a philosophical idea of the data doppelganger. That is, someone in this room lives some life and they have some conception of themselves in some philosophical sense. And everything they do is recorded. Anyone familiar with this? You have some conception of your religion, of your faith, of your sexuality, of your economics, of where you live and who you love and who you talk to, right? That's the self. Everyone have something like that going on in their head? Pretty much? Well, when you are totally under surveillance, you have a new problem, which is there's a second you. The second you is what's reflected in these databases, corporate, government, and other. And the thing is that at some point, someone will look at it and they will say, how dare you say you're straight? We see you talking to these people all the time, and we know when you talk to 10 gay people, the chances, probabilistically, of you being gay is over 80%. And so the data doppelganger becomes the real you. And you lose the ability to say things about yourself and to change. Because the data doppelganger tells a different story, and it is made up of facts. And so when, say, a prosecutor looks at this data doppelganger, it will say, you don't really believe that. You searched on Google for this. You didn't know this, you did this. You can't say you didn't know this person, you called this number. But the phone doesn't know that it was you that dialed it. It could be anyone that dialed the phone. And so this data trail becomes more you than you. And this is one of the biggest threats, especially with mandatory identification. You put these things together, and what you end up with is the ability for someone else to tell you who you are and to control what you do, even in your own mind. And so to be free of this, we must use strong mathematics and the law together. And when we do that, we make it possible to ensure that there is no criminality without detection. And that is very important. And it also makes sure that entire swaths of criminality are simply impossible. And so when people ask to secure you by making it less secure, reject it, because it is an utterly contemptible notion. Thank you.
Panelists, and it's a completely student-organized conference. One of our major motives is to ensure that students are interested in the study of law and technology. And because of this, we have a student speaker for every session. I invite Divik Joshi, who is a second-year student of National Law School, Bangalore, and is also working with the Center for Internet and Society in their privacy project. He's very interested in this topic and would like to share his paper with you.
Can you hear me? So, I mean, it's a really daunting task to follow up on 4 brilliant speakers on the issue of cybersecurity and surveillance, right? But I'm going to try and introduce a few new perspectives on this entire debate. So basically, I'm just going to be reiterating the importance of cyberspace and the importance of cybersecurity because it really needs some reiteration. Everybody, I mean, you can't stress this importance enough, right? Then I'm going to be talking about the kind of surveillance that governments nowadays have been employing, and I'm going to be talking about mass surveillance and total surveillance specifically. And then I'm leading on from that, the kind of processes and methods that they use to surveil people, and particularly focusing on data mining, right? After that, I'll be talking about the legal infrastructure within India for surveillance, and particularly looking at the IT Act and whether the legal infrastructure meets certain thresholds of privacy and data protection which have been internationally recognized. And finally, I'm just kind of redefining it and looking at what needs to change in order to make individual civil liberties and privacy more secure, while at the same time providing for security. Right? So, firstly, what is cyberspace? Now, this is like log on to Facebook and you're on Twitter, you're on cyberspace. But in like every year, you have more and more things which connect you and keep you always connected to like this metaphorical concept of the cyberspace. So it's not just social networking. It's now online shopping. It's voice over internet protocol, which is like your WhatsApp, and critical government infrastructure, which connects like government departments and really crucial information which is kept in cyberspace. It's your phone, it's your watch, it's your car, your fridge, and basically everything is now turning into is becoming connected to cyberspace in some way or the other. So what this means is that cyberspace is now a really integral part of every individual's and like of any corporate, any individual, and any government. So, and this leads me on to why cybersecurity is really important. Now, considering the importance of cyberspace, it's slightly obvious that you need to protect the integrity of the space itself, right? So, cyberspace isn't obviously perfectly safe, and you have like new challenges. You have as has already been pointed out by Mr. Tharakan, that you have new challenges emerging to breach the integrity of cyberspace, and these really need to be protected against, and the job of protecting them is primarily by the government, right? So, and also, I mean, it's really debatable as to what the misuse of cyberspace is considered as, but I think as a base threshold, you can say that using it for like some ultimate form of hate speech or terrorism can be considered as a misuse of cyberspace, which in some way needs to be protected, right? So, thirdly, what is surveillance? Now, a really broad definition, surveillance is the practice of monitoring activities for any purpose, right? And in the for cybersecurity, it's obviously the practice of monitoring online surveillance or the cyberspace in order to find out information which can better national security in some way or the other. So, and I mean, surveillance has been going on traditionally for intelligence purposes for like hundreds of years, right? Governments have been employing it. Like, you know that Appelbaum's gang was probably infiltrated by the US government at some point or the other. But the point is that these were always these traditional methods follow reasonable scientific and practical methods to surveil people and are not based on a presumption of, like, on a predetermination of criminality, which is what total surveillance aims to do. Now, total surveillance is mass surveillance, and they've already all talked about this, which is basically that through particular systems, you want to know everything about everyone and collect all the data at one point so that you can sift through it and try and like protect your cybersecurity through these means, right? So now there's three major things about this, right? Now, firstly, that any kind of surveillance methods, and when you are surveilling an entire population, you know that it has a really blatant chilling effect on civil liberties and free speech on a crucial platform such as the internet. And secondly, that it blatantly violates any kind of privacy right that an individual has. Now, thirdly, even if you conceptualize this as an exchange between security and privacy, you need to see whether any kind of whether your ultimate purpose is actually being achieved. So, is cybersecurity actually going to be strengthened through this process of total surveillance? So, and how do governments usually seek to use total surveillance in order to protect cybersecurity? It's through data mining. Now, data mining is a process which aims to track security threats and track individuals through surveillance, and it doesn't use the traditional methods of actually surveilling individuals and looking and particularly focusing on those individuals, right? It looks to draw conclusions from gigantic data sets, and the data sets we're talking about is like all of the information on the internet ever, which can potentially lead up to like billions and billions and billions of gigabytes of data. So what they aim to do is use statistics to kind of empower the government to draw general conclusions, right? But when you're talking about cybersecurity and particularly criminalization, now the problem here is that the risks and particularly the false positives that are going to come out of these statistical improbabilities is really, really huge, right? So it's not, for example, data mining might be useful in the case where the risks are really negligible. Theoretically, if Facebook uses your data absolutely perfectly and only for advertising purposes, then it can, say, give you better data about what you want. But when you're using it to criminalize people, the risks presented are completely humongous. And I mean, as Jacob pointed out and as Mr. Saikat pointed out, that I mean, firstly, as a system itself, it has several fallacies because it's impossible or it's really, really difficult to draw absolute conclusions from general patterns of surveillance. And secondly, that, as you said, in a completely incompetent infrastructural system as is in India, it becomes even further complicated, especially when you have acts like the UAPA or like the POT earlier, right? So what you're doing is basically you're criminalizing people based on certain a priori assumptions that the government has, and I think that this really is the peril of data mining, and this is basically why surveillance is not really going to work, because you're considering a gigantic amount of a gigantic data set in order to really insignificant